George Pal's War of the Worlds was released in 1953, and it got great reviews. One of my favorites is from Variety. A Sacco science fiction feature, it can't be recommended for the weak-hearted, but to the many who delight in the occasional good scare, it's Sacco entertainment of hackle-raising quality.
What studio would not want two Saccos and a hackle? That's a great review. In the early 1950s, there were a number of cultural factors that really contributed to why this film was made and why it had such a big effect on audiences.
If we could gather all the energy expended in just one square dance, we could send that meteor back to where it came from.
This was a time where America had great fears about atomic war. There were weapons of super science. Out of the skies could come atomic missiles from the enemy at any time. And this was obviously a source of great paranoia.
Is that a fireball or something? Boy, that's big.
Coupled with that was a big interest in UFOs. Flying saucers were in the news, people were spotting them, there were reports of this sort of thing, and there was therefore a heightened interest and even almost an expectation that maybe there's alien civilizations out there. Thirdly, there was a great interest in space travel. After the war, the United States acquired the German missile program, combined it with American engineering, and for the first time, they were sending rockets into the stratosphere. And so there's a great deal of publicity about we're going into space. Maybe we'll go to the moon and eventually beyond. So the film had a great impact because of the perspective of the times. I remember a magazine cover. I saw it at a neighbor's house, and it showed an atomic bomb blast as a painting done by Chesley Bonestell of what it would look like if it destroyed an American city, created a huge fiery crater. And that terrified me, seeing that, because I realized this could happen to where I live. And I remember going outside, looking in the sky, and almost expecting at some point some kind of missile to come down from somewhere.
Bonestell, working with Wernher von Braun, also did a whole series of the exploration of space. Ultimately, many engineers from NASA were inspired to get into the space program because of his original series. Bonestell also worked as a matte painter on War of the Worlds. His major contribution was the opening sequence, the tour of the planets. He created the background paintings that would work with a little foreground miniature, and that allowed the beautiful exploration of our solar system.
The Martians considered Saturn an attractive world with its many moons and beautiful rings of cosmic dust.
A young writer named Herbert George Wells, otherwise known as H.G. Wells, wrote the original story and introduced to the public the idea of an alien invasion.
Their nearest world was giant Jupiter, where there are titanic cliffs of lava and ice.
One of the concepts the movie kept from the original novel was a prologue, which asks the questions, can life exist on these other planets? Maybe yes, maybe no. They're pretty hostile environments. They show that Earth is a unique place, but there was one other possibility of life, and that was on Mars, and who knows what cold, evil brains were living there that might do us harm.
Or could they go to Mercury, nearest planet to the sun? It has no air.
They hired Cedric Hardwicke to do the voiceover, which was a good choice because having a British accent, and since the story originally took place in England, written by an Englishman, it kind of wrapped that idea together and made it seem appropriate. Cecil B. DeMille, who was one of the founders of Paramount, back in the 1920s, actually acquired the rights to make a movie version of War of the Worlds from H.G. Wells, and that property sat around on DeMille's desk for a couple of decades, and he never made it. Around 1950, along comes a producer named George Pal. He was an animator from Europe, doing stop-motion animation, originally for advertising. But then, on his own, being interested in space travel, George Pal produced a film called Destination Moon in 1950, which was the first film to depict, in a scientific way, space travel. And it was capitalizing on the new interest in space travel in the country. The film was very well received, and Pal got a deal to make some more films at Paramount. And so Pal picked up that property at Paramount that DeMille was not going to make, War of the Worlds, and began packaging it together to make his version of the story.
In 1938, another Wells, Orson Welles, did a radio teleplay of the H.G. Wells novel. Wells decided to update it to contemporary times so that listeners would be frightened by it. And George Pal did the same thing.
I got a message for you.
He updated War of the Worlds to make it more contemporary for 1950 audiences, moving it to California and then ultimately an attack on Los Angeles.
Paramount proceeded to develop the film, and they wrote a letter to the Department of Defense asking permission to get use of the U.S. Army because there were so many scenes in the film where the Army is fighting off the Martian invaders. There is the letter they got back from the Department of Defense. It is worth mentioning that the picture does nothing which could be said to have any public informational value to the Department of Defense. On the contrary, it shows the military to be inept and incapable of stemming the imaginary attack from Mars. Under these circumstances, it would not be possible to use real troops for use in connection with the production of your picture. I would imagine a lot of film companies in the 1950s got that same letter because they rarely depicted, I don't think they ever depicted our military forces being able to conquer invaders from space. Well, undaunted, Paramount did go ahead and they made arrangements with the Arizona National Guard, which wasn't under the same authority, apparently, and they agreed to provide their rocket launchers, tanks, and men for filming in the picture. I guess they didn't mind being looked upon as inept at stemming an alien invasion.
Hello, Tower. This is Air Force Flying Wing, ready for takeoff. Over.
They also had a stock shot of the Flying Wing, the YB-49, made from Northrop. It's the plane that drops the atom bomb on the Martians. And ultimately, it was an airplane that was not successful, but it did represent this modern, futuristic look of aviation. And then years later, it became the inspiration and prototype for the B-2 stealth bomber. So now we have flying wings again.
If you have no goggles, turn away.
But the stock shots in the film were from a science short subject that Paramount produced. So they just used those shots and cut it into the film. Another major contributor who worked closely with George Pal was director Byron Haskin. Now, Byron Haskin was a visual effects supervisor before he was a director, so it was felt that he would understand the complexities of making a film like this. With so many visual effects shots, he would be able to control it and make sure that the quality and the impact of how the story was being told was well integrated with the actors and the visual effects together. Another great thing about War of the Worlds is the color of the film. George Barnes was a cinematographer, and he was known for his black and white work. He'd worked with Hitchcock on Rebecca and received an Oscar for his work in that film. So very few color films, and he pulls out all the stops. Bright red colors, intensity, dark, moody scenes. He really brought a lot of drama to the story with the Technicolor process.
Something's happening.
It's fun to go through all the publicity photos made for the movie. They show you how they were trying to market it. And of course, it's always the case, the stars consult with the DP about the design of the movie.
So it seems like the marketing department didn't really know what to do with a science fiction subject. Most of the photos of the actors are kind of goofing off on the set and just feeling silly.
Here we have Les Tremayne, the general of all the armies, showing Ann Robinson how to operate an M1 carbine.
Unfortunately, she never got to do that kind of scene. She tends to yell and scream and be frightened all the way through the movie, and I think all of us today would like to see her pick up one of those rifles and start shooting at the Martians.
Here's Gene Barry in his radiation suit. He's appearing to be weightless. He does appear in this suit in the movie when the atomic bomb goes off. And of course, we know that those suits will not protect you at all from the blast of an atomic bomb.
The Edith Head costume, which doesn't appear in the film, dresses up Ann Robinson as sort of an alien space girl. It's pretty silly. We asked Ann about this, and it seems like this was just a PR stunt. She dressed up in this costume and walked around the Paramount lot and visited various executives. Very campy.
Now here's Gene Barry on his bike. He's joyriding, perhaps being a little too casual at this moment, because we found in other studio paperwork an accident report that showed that Gene Barry fell off his bicycle one afternoon and had to go to the infirmary for a bruised derriere. And This picture shows one of the really well-done stunts in the movie, and in fact, it might have been the first time someone was entirely enveloped in fire. Possibly The Thing did it first, but they laid claim to the fact that this was the first movie. It's a great shot where a soldier gets burned by the heat ray and runs around on fire. The stuntman who performed this dangerous task was Harvey Perry, and he worked in Hollywood from silent days all the way to the early 1970s. He did get burned in the scene, and not badly, but enough to file an accident report with the studio. It's interesting when you look at the accident report, you see that he was paid $55 for that stunt, which I would imagine a stuntman today would get probably 100 times that to do that particular stunt. But Perry was part of the original group of stuntmen in Hollywood who really just lived by the seat of their pants every day. When Harvey Perry gets burned as the soldier, there's a scream dubbed in for his horrible death. And that scream intrigued me because I heard it in numerous other Paramount films of that era. You can hear it in Gunfight at the OK Corral and other films. In fact, I traced its origin to The Lost Weekend with Ray Milland. It's a scene where Ray is in an asylum where alcoholics recover, and one of his fellow patients goes mad and starts imagining there's spiders attacking, and he's trying to climb out the window and doing this scream. And it was such a good scream, such an insane death, that scream was put in their library and used over and over again for a long time.
So, of course, in any kind of film where the Martians are going to attack Los Angeles, you need an iconic image. And for us, it would be City Hall. That's sort of the focal point of Los Angeles. So, of course, the Martians have to destroy that, and that's a very effective sequence. They built a plaster miniature and then exploded it with this great explosion, which is what we call the 1-2 punch. There's an initial explosion and then a secondary explosion, which then destroys the rest of the building. They would only have one chance at this, but they got it right on the first take, and it looks terrific. The Martian war machine glides toward it and then utterly destroys the iconic image of Los Angeles. Another very effective sequence in the film is when the Martians repel any of the weaponry from the army. They do that by creating this electronic force field. And the way they did that is they had these glass domes that were rigged with little pyro explosions all over them. They have this glass that fades up over the Martian war machine to give it its sort of protection. It's a great little sequence and works together really, really well. So also in the archives, we found that element of the domes and the pyro explosions. And you can see it being slated, and then it's being photographed as an element, which would then be composited over the Martian war machines later. Another idea they had, which was very effective, was they would create some of the sequences in miniature and then recreate them as full-scale sets. And they could cut in between the miniature work and the live-action work for the various sequences. So with the scout plane that crashes, you have that scout plane as a full-scale piece that the actors interact with, and then also as a miniature piece when the Martians come and attack it. Back in the 50s, the blue screen process wasn't very convincing as a way to combine elements together. So what they decided to do was to create big miniature sets, big environments, the California countryside or the streets of downtown Los Angeles as miniatures, and then have the war machines fly through those environments. Hanging from tracks overhead on the set, they would glide through the environments while explosions and interactive lighting happened. There were 15 different piano wires attached to the war machine that was about 42 inches across. The war machines themselves were sculpted first out of clay, and then castings were made. They were made out of copper, and they made 3 of them. Unfortunately, none of these machines exist anymore. We don't really know what happened to them. Some people say that they were given away for a copper drive, but who wouldn't want to have a Martian war machine to look at in a museum today? Al Nozaki was the film's art director, And he's responsible for designing the Martian war machine. That sort of manta ray looking design with the cobra head, that was all his development, which is an enormous contribution. The design of that spacecraft still resonates today as being something that just looks really cool. So Nozaki would go through the script and he would do little storyboards for every scene in the picture, as well as other design aspects that would need to be figured out. What does the Martian eye look like? What do the Martians look like?
Forrester, everybody's been looking for you.
I know, we walked halfway from Corona.
Here's the Martian eye, which has the red, green, and blue camera in it, very similar to how the Technicolor camera worked, which is kind of fun.
That's how the Martians, yes.
And, you know, audiences in the 1950s were just starting to get RCA color TVs, so they would understand that process of 3 colors as a way to create imagery and video. Here's a picture of Lee Vasquez. He's a prop man, and he's working on the miniatures between takes, and he's revealing some of the mechanics that are inside that position the Cobra arm. Eventually, the war machines crash and the aliens die. But visual effects supervisor Gordon Jennings was having problems because as soon as the war machine would crash on a street, all the wires that were holding it, the 15 piano wires, would suddenly become slack, and you noticed that. You saw that right away, and it looked really fake. So they came up with the idea of whenever the war machine was going to crash, it would fly into a telephone pole, breaking it in half. That allowed wires from the telephone pole to fall on the miniature, and then the mingling of the wires, you didn't notice what was what. So it was a brilliant way to solve the problem and find a solution that would work for the movie. Ben and I wanted to dig deeper into how the visual effects and sound effects were created in War of the Worlds, and there's just not a lot of information available. There's nobody to talk to today. So we decided we wanted to recreate a shot to understand all the elements that would go into it. Now, some elements we found still existed in the Paramount archives, but others had to be created. Ultimately, by putting these elements together, we got a greater understanding of how the visual effects and sound effects were created for the film. We were very happy to find the original outtake for one of the shots from the film. You can see the cameraman slate the shot, the camera coming up to speed. In this case, the Technicolor camera takes some time to get up to 96 frames per second. The slow motion was necessary to slow down the fire and the pyro explosions. Then we see the miniature war machine slowly gliding down the street, suspended from wires overhead. At the end of the take, the machine stops and the camera ramps back down, and you can see that the edge of the war machine even catches on fire a little bit. So this is what we added all our effects to: visual effects and the audible effects. The skeleton beam and the heat ray, and then all the sound effects to create a sequence from the film.
Come on.
So Ben started by exploring how some of the sound effects were created. He had a copy of some of the original recordings, but how they were actually made, nobody really knows. Paramount had some records that Ken Strickfaden worked on War of the Worlds. So Ben started his exploration with Ken.
Ken Strickfaden, Mr. Electric, as he was known, was an amazing inventor and performer. He was the man responsible for building all of those wonderful laboratory props for Flash Gordon and Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein, all the spark coils and Tesla coils and arcs and things. And he supplied them to movie sets over the years, and they were all mechanisms of his own invention. And he was also very interested in sound and produced several sound effects machines along the way as well. He had come on board at Paramount initially to do some experiments. Could he produce what looked like repelling rays that are holding the Martian war machines so they can hover over the landscape? And Ken figured out a way to put extremely high voltage between the ground and the model such that sparks would travel. George Powell, in one of his accounts of the making of the movie, mentions that they were blowing the sparks that were the repeller rays with a fan to get them to travel up and down the wires. But this was a very dangerous thing to do on the movie set because it involved such a potential for creating a fire that might have consumed the set or gotten out of control, or somebody might have gotten hurt. And ultimately, for safety concerns, they gave up that idea. But it did work, and you can see the strict-faden effect in the very early shots of the machines as they come up out of the gully.
Supported from the ground by rays, probably some form of magnetic flux like invisible legs. This is amazing.
War of the Worlds demanded some very specialized sound work and sound effects work. They really needed special sound effects just like they needed special visual effects. Leith Stevens, who had worked for George Pal before on Destination Moon and When Worlds Collide, was brought in to do the score. He also had some sessions where the orchestra provided tonalities and some other sounds specifically used for the development of the Martian war machines and the weapons associated with them. So I have here many of the sound effects that were created for this film. The sound of the Martian scream. They experimented with different human screams and animal screams, but what they ended up with was taking the squeal of dry ice touching metal, and they took a scream of a woman played backwards, so it was a little weird, like this, and you put the two together to give you the weird, unearthly Martian scream. One of the new and innovative techniques of the day was called tape feedback. While you're recording a sound, the machine can output that sound and it gets recorded a second time on top of itself playing. And this gives you weird repetition of the sound and rippling effects. They would take a little bit of feedback, that kind of a sound, it was just done on a tape recorder, and make a loop of it so it would repeat in a cycle. Like this. And that becomes the weird sound of just the presence of the Martian war machine, especially when its weapon is turned on and it's slowly hunting people down.
So the Martians had two major weapons that were part of the war machine. They had what was called the skeleton beam, which was a kind of a green plasma that would fire out of the blisters. And then they also had the heat ray, which was used to set things on fire. And that emanated from the top of this positionable Cobra arm that could move around and find targets as the war machine was gliding over the landscapes.
A sound they used for the beam warming up is actually one of Ken Strickfaden's electrical devices when you turn it on. It's just like turning on a fluorescent light, but magnified greatly. So they, once again, make a repeating loop of this sound, and you get the sound of the heat ray building up to strength. Then the actual beam, the heat ray shooting itself, is a single guitar stroke on an electric guitar. Now, an electric guitar in 1953 was an exotic new piece of technology, not something the audience would have heard as much, and therefore it has an otherworldly connection. It's not something familiar. It sounds like this. Strictly plucking on one string, running your finger down it a little bit to change pitch. And several of them cut together in sequence, so it becomes the sound of the heat ray blasting away.
So we found some footage of what looked to be like a acetylene cutting torch that was used for the sparks that come out of the heat ray. And that was blown by compressed air or a fan so that they could direct it and then composite it into the scene. So now we had elements to put a shot together. But we don't have optical printers anymore, which is what Paramount would have used back in the 1950s. So we composited digitally to get the sense of how the elements would work together.
Everybody!
The skeleton beam. The skeleton beam is the elusive one. We believe the source of the sound is some sort of spring, a large shock absorber on a truck, or it might have been a spring for an old garage door, you know, they're pulled open with springs. It might have been something like a slinky. Now, that sound is very famous from War of the Worlds, but it wasn't entirely original with War of the Worlds. It occurs in an earlier Paramount film, My Favorite Spy, where Bob Hope and Hedy Lamarr are kissing inside a barrel, and the barrel bursts open. And for a comic effect, that distinctive sound of the skeleton beam is used. And many of you may also recognize that sound because it became even more famous for being the photon torpedo sound in the classic Star Trek TV series. It has quite a bit of history.
We never found an element, the visual element for the skeleton beam in the archives, and so that was part of our process of recreating it using the Strickfaden effect.
In pursuit of the unknown, we went back to Ken Strickfaden's attempt to produce the repeller rays. There was an arc that was trying to look like it was supporting the war machines. And we had read that they had blown it with a fan, the actual sparks with a fan, to kind of break them up in some way. We really felt we needed to try this ourselves. So we made contact with a man named John Barron, and he has a kind of a lab over in Oakland, California, where a number of people do a lot of experiments in the Ken Strickfaden style, working with arcs, working with electric arc, working with Tesla coils, and so on. So we went there to see if we could figure out how these effects were done. We started by producing what's called a Jacob's ladder, a crawling spark between two parallel wires.
Powered up, then air.
Yeah, I think that could be the stuff.
Normally you see it mounted vertically as it appears in mad scientist laboratories, but you can also lay it out horizontally on the floor. We took a hairdryer, and as that spark traveled along the wires, the spark would get broken up in kind of ripply, jagged fashion, looking a lot like the visuals in the film used for the skeleton beam.
Lights, action.
We just tinted it green and got a very good-looking element. So here's the result of all those efforts. Putting these elements together to create a new shot from the movie. This is the stock shot of the background. It includes the miniature war machine and the miniature street. It has pyro elements and smoke elements. We're adding digitally the heat ray and the skeleton beam along with Ben's sound effects to make the final shots. So we're very pleased with the result. Using the digital compositing technique to bring in the existing elements and having an interaction with them really taught us how the visual effects people created that amazing work back in the 1950s.
Hello there, what do you see?
War of the Worlds was nominated for 3 Oscars: editing, sound mixing, and special effects. It won for special effects. Gordon Jennings received the Oscar for it. And it is a tribute to his work and the film that it is still so amazingly entertaining today as a classic science fiction film. It's been remade several times. There's been television shows, but the 1953 version, in my mind, is still the definitive version of the film.